Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining our ISBS Webinar Series this month. So today we are very happy to have Dr. Satrajit Roychoudhury from Pfizer to present prediction of overall survival from disease progression dynamics in metastatic cancer trials. So Dr. Satrajit Roychoudhury is an executive director and head of the Statistical Research and Innovation Group in Pfizer. He has extensive experience in working with different phases of clinical trials for drug and vaccine. Satrajit is an elected fellow of the ASA and recipient of Royal Statistical Society Statisticians in the Pharmaceutical Industry Statistical Excellence in the Pharmaceutical Industry Award in 2023 and Young Statistical Scientist Award from the International Indian Statistical Association in 2019. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Roychoudhury for his presentation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Hank, for such a nice introduction. And thank you for inviting me. And thanks to everybody for being present on a Friday afternoon for the talk. I'm just trying to share my screen. And can you confirm that? Can everybody see the slides?
Yeah, I can see the slide.
Perfect. Thank you. So first of all, thank you again all for attending. So today I'm just my goal was just kind of sharing some ideas. It's not related to the analysis perspective, but more of a related to a trial conduct perspective, where how can we bring in the predictive modeling in to help that? And it was not really a machine learning exercise, right? Because now that's kind of a becoming more commonly used term for our prediction algorithm. How as a statistician, with our training with prediction that we receive, how can we use our statistical model to sort of build up, enrich the data in order to make better prediction? So just a quick, so this is the joint work with, so the project, actually it all started with an interesting project, which kind of elaborated further with collaboration of a summer intern, CD Wang, who was a summer intern 2 years back in Pfizer, and now I think she's in Merck actually. And then with her advisor, Kelly Kidwell, and of course my colleague, Bo Huang, who has a very important input about the whole project where it all started. And of course, we want to thank Professor Gusheng Yan for very many helpful discussions I had with him regarding the conceptual methodological framework. So just a quick disclaimer, whatever I present are only my views, and it's nothing to relate with Pfizer, or it cannot be, it really not coming from any Pfizer or Pfizer as a company or its associates. So it needless to say, I think the most of the people in this call are very, very familiar with our majority of the drug development, including oncology, are always in a phased out manner, where most of the time in oncology, we often combine phase 1 and phase 2, sort of looking into dose finding and preliminary efficacy and safety on the same time. However, this talk today was mainly focused on phase 3 studies, which are typically, of course, there are exceptions available, but however, most often those are randomized, stratified, blinded trial versus standard of control, care of or placebo. The typical endpoints are overall survival, progression-free survival, or some cases objective-free response, or even PR, and we also look into as a secondary PRO endpoint. And usually most of the trials are designed, except there are more issues about non-proportional hazard, but majority of the trial are event-driven. So what are our outcome of interest as a primary endpoint? The primary analysis are usually driven by number of event, give us the required statistical characteristic. Of course, it's followed by more phase 4 studies where the methodology I'm going to talk about can still be usable for planning purposes. So as most of us know in this call that approximately 80% of the registration trial recently were accepted as progression-free survival as an endpoint. Of course, there is the overall always the decisions were always based on the overall benefit risk. However, progression as a use of progression-free survival endpoint give a certain benefit, like in terms of sample size and a follow-up domain. Just in case you're not familiar with, progression-free survival is an endpoint defined from time to randomization until the tumor progression or death on any cause. So it's kind of a composite endpoint in nature. And in a recent study, actually, it shows that using a PFS expedited the overall drug approval process by approximate a year, which is getting the drug to the needy patient much faster in a way. But however, the discussion is always benefit risk, just one and not only one endpoint. Though progression-free survival was taken as a primary endpoint, however, the overall survival is still remain one of the gold standard when we assess treatment efficacy. And of course, there are more challenges when we try to do overall survival analysis due to the crossover and other reason. However, benefit of OS is still considered as one of the gold standard. Usually, even we do in PFS as an endpoint, most of the regulators need the mature OS data, especially for further consideration. And in next stage, when especially we go to health technology assessment or health economic modeling in a pricing application, OS data overall by OS and overall survival, time to death, that improvement in the time to death plays a very important role there into the pricing discussions. So it is very important that in the trial to have a robust overall OS analysis, which is most often not present when we do the PFS analysis, especially many of the approvals, when we do PFS analysis at the interim stage, OS data tend to be a lot more immature. So the question was, how could we plan for when to do this analysis? And we get a mature OS data in order to perform do a robust statistical conclusion out of it. And what data can we use that we accrued in the trial in order to predict that timing, which is very important for planning purposes as well as for publishing perspective, as well as regulatory communication and communication with HTAs around the world. So the general practice is what we have seen so far. People usually use death data only for this prediction. So they take time to death, the current data, basically fit a parametric model or semi-parametric model. Weibull and piecewise, we have seen the use of most, wherever exponential model can be used if your data is way mature. But most often when we are talking about interim or less motile population, their data is not so mature to fit an exponential distribution. And then we basically look into multiple parametric model. Usually what happens in HTA exercise, they fit different parametric model and choose the best model in order to predict the survival of the patient and to calculate basically the expected life gain and the corresponding cost associated with it. So the idea was basically but just think about it. When we are doing all this exercise, we're totally ignoring a fact that we have a very solid progression data, which has a good relationship with overall survival in most of the cancer setting. And can we leverage that data for prediction? Just to mention that this question is not new, that what is can progression-free benefit in progression-free survival can be transferred into OS? This is a very well-known question. A lot of literature has been explored into this area between surrogacy, intermediate transformation, how to transfer effect size from one to another. However, that's not the scope of this exercise at all. We are not looking for predicting OS effect from PFS. Our goal is, how can we use this tumor progression data into a good prediction of the timing when one can do a robust OS analysis? I just wanted to mention a few literature that is very popularly known in the area that, and that's where we started our work when this problem, and I'm going to, just in a moment, going to mention the motivation, how this problem came. So basically we were, there were a lot of literature exists, as I mentioned, to relationship between tumor progression and death. Fleischer in 2009, who looked into time to event distribution using a bivariate exponential model, looking into the relationship. There are other literature looking into copula model, linking them. Recently, we have seen some of the exercise coming up with the multi-state model, of course, enriched by basically into the joint modeling framework as well as the meta-analysis. However, though we use this, we're going to use some of this concept, but our goal is a little bit different from this literature, that we are not really looking into an OS effect in this paper, but rather more like a prediction. So at a current time, we're trying to predict when the survival data would be mature and one can do a robust analysis. Of course, the same methodology is applicable to find the predicted OS size. So here is where the whole story begins. So we were trying to looking for a renal cell carcinoma trial, and there were 800 patients. So unfortunately, this whole exercise, this setup is taken from a real study. However, the data and the summary we use, they are all basically simulated from summary statistics rather than using the trial data for the confidentiality purposes. So we were looking into a renal cancer trial where novel treatment was compared with the SOC arm. The study has 800 patients randomized 1:1 standard setting with treatment versus standard of care. The RECIST 1.1 criteria was used for the tumor assessment. Tumor assessment schedule was every 6 weeks for first 18 months and then 12 weeks afterwards. The primary endpoint was PFS, and the analysis was done. We just simplified the setting for this presentation. We say there's no interim. Suppose there is one primary analysis when the required number of PFS events are accrued, which is 397 PFS event, which is the first analysis of OS analysis as well for the regulatory reporting. However, when it has been planned based on the assumptions and the design assumptions. It seems in order to do a reasonably statistically sound OS analysis, we need around 341 deaths. So the question is, when that analysis, the question comes to the clinical team, when this analysis will be will be performed? Can we predict that timeline in a way in the current setting? So just to quickly show how the data looks at PFS, of course, we have a very profound PFS. OS data has a trend, of course. However, when the question is, it's still not statistically significant, or there's a huge censoring to make a robust conclusion or a reasonable conclusion, statistical conclusion out of it. So the first question was when the OS data can be analyzed, which and how there's of course a question come in, if this data goes with such a trend and given the PFS, can we predict something about how the survival effect will emerge, or for both leveling, but more than for a pricing discussion in a general, that can we do a better health economic modeling based on that. So based on the literature, when we looked into the literature, people looking into different setting, we tried to look into 4 candidate models: Weibull model, multivariate survival model, which is copula type model, exploring time to progression and overall survival; multi-state model, which is basically you think about, you go from one state to another, from initial to progression to death, or maybe some people go death directly. And then another new class of model which we try to propose is using a little bit more granular level of the progression-free survival using a multivariate joint model, which I'm going to explain in a moment. So first start with more simpler setting of a model, which we try to start, and basically, and one of the literature also kind of mentioned that, can we explore the correlation between time to event and survival after time to progression in that. So in order to do that, we link this so uniform. So we basically had a marginal model. So we modeled the time to progression and OS minus time to the gap time using Weibull distribution, and link them, which is there are many ways to link it. We find copula models are more generalized in a way, and we link them using a copula model, using the corresponding functional relationship, basically, which is tuned by this factor delta, which kind of measured the degree of association between them. The second class of model was we are kind of looking into it on a different way. One is looking into the standard illness of death model mentioned in the recurrent survival analysis, especially multi-state model survival analysis literature. Also, there are other approaches, like one can think about every death is preceded by progression, which in our setting is hard to make that assumption. So we actually created a full illness death model where some of the patients die without progression. However, many cases, most of the cases, basically death is preceded by progression. So we modeled each of these transition probabilities, pi LK, which is basically, it's a hazard from going to state L, where your previous state was K. We modeled them using a semi-Markov structure. That means basically it depends on the last stage. If you are, whatever the last stage was, it's mainly it depends on. And if we model these transition hazards using a Weibull regression model, just to have a more flexibility in the parameter space. Then we come back to the problem that how progression-free survival dynamics looks like. And if you look into the progression-free survival dynamics, is actually not a single measurement that one defines progression. And as you and many of, I'm sure, the people in this audience are so knowledgeable about the oncology, basically it has a many component in it. Some of them are target lesion, the lesion that you basically measure are measurable, are big ones at the baseline, and you measure them longitudinally over the time. The non-target lesion, which are maybe not, they exist, but they are not measurable at the beginning. However, they can be worsening over the time. And then new lesion, the lesions can appear, which was not present in the baseline. And as well as we see, in death of any cause is also part of this. So progression by definition is driven by all these different components. And just a table is taken from the paper, the RESIST 1.1 paper. It's basically any of this getting worsening, the patients were declared progression. So our question was, are we just taking that as a one time to event data? Are we justifying, is that somehow reducing the amount of information? And can using them elaborately help the prediction further? So as I quickly mentioned you, I'm not going to go, this is just, I mentioned, so that our idea was, can we sort of use this 4 different components into the prediction and make the prediction better in a way? So in case, so the question is how to do that. How can we bring them? Because these are 4. One is a maybe competing risk of other. There may be a lot of other information may not be available, because once one progression is determined, there's a possibility that the other information is not available. So we just using a standard joint model structure is far more complex. So what we looked into is a little bit more pragmatic approach, how to bring this information in. So we started to, and this is just to quickly show how the tumor dynamics was over the trial, so that we clearly see that, and as we have seen, there's a prolific effect of PFS, is the target lesion burden. So this is the target lesion burden taken at each time, and this is the percentage sum of the longest diameter that drastically reduced basically for the experimental arm compared to standard of care, which is expected from the effect that we have seen. The question was, can we use this rich data where the treated people burden is continuously going down in order to make our prediction better? So the first thing we looked into, okay, so instead of thinking about each of them as a joint process and each of them as a related, we start to think about, okay, let's think about somebody's target lesion profile and how that predict the overall survival. So the first component of the model comes from exploring the relationship between their target lesion, which is measured over time, and linking them with shared parameter model with the survival death. And the covariate that we used was gender, age, and other very important ones. I just did not disclose this due to the due to the confidentiality of the data. So the idea was, can use of information from progression into the survival model help us to predict? So the patient who did not die, so the idea was basically we look into whoever is died, we take their death time, whoever is still alive, ongoing in the trial, we predict their future time point. Then we look into the combined data set and see when the target number of event is achieving. So the question is, using the progression, the target lesion data, can that help this prediction? But the question was very interesting how it is coming up into this setting, basically. That it's not only target lesion, we have seen quite a bit of appearance of the new lesion. And then the question comes in, is that factor has basically any predictability for the overall survival of the patient? So having more non-target lesion, can that affect the survival compare even their even their target lesion or overall tumor burden may be on a stable situation? So basically what we try to look into is this different risk factor towards survival. So we developed two more prediction model. The second prediction model, we look in take it as a time to event data, because non-target lesion, it's usually we do not have the measure, we have worsening and stabilizing. Sometimes it's missing, we saw in the data set. However, we just find that time to worsening is a variable which we can measure pretty well overall for the non-target lesion. Similarly, because a new lesion is kind of a binary variable, it doesn't exist in the baseline, it appears. So we take it as a setting like time to new lesion. So these two variables, we added two more time variables into that data, and we looked into if that time variable has an effect on the overall survival. So one definitely, and what we try to do is basically try to link the two overall survival. So overall survival and as well as the new target lesion information to predict the survival further. And the question again, we model the marginal ones in using the Weibull regression model. There's two questions come in here, and you can ask the question that even if there is always been that survival comes basically after progression in most of the setting, conceptually as well, most of the deaths are. So how can we take care of that ordered relationship into this model? The models are parameterized that way in order to make sure that overall survival median is higher than the new lesion or new lesion or non-target lesion medians. So we actually put that parameter constraint into the model while estimation and prediction. And similar model has been used just to show we actually use a Weibull model for each marginal and combine them with the Clayton copula again. So, and then when we were looking into this three model, there are a few concepts came in that, okay, once the patient actually had progression, there are many patients who start to cross over, and there are many other reasons, and that's really not captured by the progression itself. So we should still look into that overall survival alone modeling, especially the patient who are longer survivors and maybe discontinue treatment as well by that time. So how can we take the risk of them, which is not really driven by progression directly? And so now we have like four set of prediction of overall survival. Survival predicted by target lesion, survival predicted by non-target lesion, by new target lesion, as well as just looking into the data alone without any other corresponding related variable. The question is how we combine it. So basically all these four, how we bridge it, how can we make it all together to have one prediction? One of the natural way to do, so just to let you know that when I talked about the prediction, all the models were fitted in a Bayesian setting, and we actually used a posterior predictive distribution, which kind of a very natural way of prediction if we average over the current parameter knowledge using the posterior distribution to look into the prediction basically of the additional time the patient was alive. It's going to be predicted to be alive. Sorry, the right word. So now the question is, how can we combine them? So we have four models in our hand. So one natural way to combine them is the use of Bayesian averaging model. So we kind of start with that all predictions are equally, then learn from the data that which model is more likely to, which more favorable to data to make the prediction. The weights get updated using the Bayes law. So basically, it's a weighted average of all, where the model, so basically the first part is all the predictions that coming out from the model and with the data, and it's averaged over the weight, which weight is basically determined by using Bayes' theorem, looking into which model is most likely given the current data in this. So one question come in the question that, okay, we hear a lot about models ensembling, which also exist in machine learning literature quite a bit. What's the why it's and what we bring in? What is the difference with Bayesian model averaging? So if you look into the model ensembling literature, the model ensembling is more of a simple combination rather than a probabilistic weighting in BMA. It's the choice of weights are based on basically how on different factors and in model assembling. And also the idea was to similarly building a diversity of model with different strength, and then sort of look into cross-validation or some kind of calibration into choose of the best modeling, what usually the exercise of a model ensembling. And both are very powerful methods and important in many occasions, whereas here we find BMA is more appropriate because it's kind of a intuitively looking into the data, and it does this uncertainty quantification more naturally by its formulation, and which we find is much more natural in this setting. However, there is a caveat of BMA. As you can understand, with a complex model space, each of these MCMC iteration needs extensive computation because we have to calculate all the weights. We get the model estimate, we get the MCMC sampler, update the weight, and then basically averaging over. We kind of repeating that. It takes quite a bit of computation resources in that. So just coming back, so I talked about the model. I mean, they are all theoretically nice. The question is how they really work for the prediction. So just to remind you, the setting, when the trial started in 2016, the analysis, the primary analysis when the targeted number of PFS1 event is reached was around June, around 2 years after. At the time, the number of death was 146. So what we did, we looked into a backward snapshot of the data that when 100 events were accrued, 146 when the primary analysis time, 200 events were accrued, and 300 events were accrued. We tried to predict that how it's predicting the 341 event. So this exercise, just to let you know, the exercise that I'm seeing, we looked into this data retrospectively. So we know the actual number of when it achieved. So we kind of are back calculating it in order to, so this trial we use for testing to apply for another setting. So basically we try to see how our model fits. In order to, we do two more exercises to understand. We also use the model to predict number of event when you have a 50 deaths and 100 deaths at primary analysis to see how close any of these four candidate model works. We also did some extensive simulation to see the model operating characteristics. I'm going to go through them right now. So with that, so let's look into the first. So So in this setting, when we were looking into the uh, uh, renal cancer trial, we have the covariates based on the clinical discussion we considered is basically based on age, then gender, ECOG, baseline, tumor burden, uh, nephrectomy at baseline, and other criteria, which identified as important criteria by the clinicians of that. Of course, one can do if you want. I mean, we in this exercise, we included all the covariates. However, one can definitely do a model selection and you can choose the best variable selection and you can choose the best model, best set of variables based on that. That's absolutely a flexible part. So at this one, we did not use any non-baseline covariate, which brings up basically a time-dependent modeling. However, that can be doable in this setting. However, one has to be careful how that dynamics is evolving. For this, we actually used a weekly informative prior because we are not using any other trial information data. The decision is mainly data-driven. However, we actually looked into many constellation of prior and in order to understand the sensitivity of the prediction. Then all calculations here are done in R and ZAGs. I mean, this was 2-3. I mean, Stan can able to handle very similar calculations as well. So here is how. So as I mentioned in the beginning, that we actually looked into 4 main candidate model, looking into so JM represent the joint modeling, Coppola, where we model the PFS, and OS minus PFS in using a Clayton Coppola, where each of the marginal are modeled using a Weibull regression model. Marginal model means it's only using survival data alone, using Weibull regression in order to predict that given the survival data, how the prediction would look like. MS is a multi-state model, which is using a semi-Markov structure using the illnet date structure we discussed earlier. So, and here in the x-axis represent the number of death where we did the data constellation, basically. So basically 100 means we kind of censored the data after 100 deaths. So each other patient who are died after 100, after that day, when 100 death happened, were censored at that day. Similar for 146, 200, and 300. So we basically make the patient ongoing in order to see how the prediction looks like. It was very evident for us when we were looking into that alone looking into survival data was never been a good predictor, unless, I mean, you are very close to the final. Including PFS or including the progression data definitely improved the prediction. And we saw that especially the multi-state model as well as the joint model, both were kind of working very well in this. Coppola model also is pretty well, but it has some convergence issues we find at the early stage. However, we say either or all these 3 models are very capable, whereas we saw that multi-state model has a little bit overshooting problem at the end. It's kind of overestimate the death, because on the y-axis we actually have the death when it happened. The red dot here is the exact time when 200 event happened, and we find that the Coppola model and the survival model are much closer compared to multi-state. But however, I just wanted to mention that multi-state is actually overall a pretty good candidate as well. Basically, ignoring the mechanism completely, which is a standard exercise now, we do it in a trial, is not a good exercise to do. At least one think about bring the progression data. And it's very interesting when we discussed that with the clinician a little bit, so we looked into how the models or how weight of different model varies. Basically, some model varies in the joint model when we were trying to see after different number of events. So remember, in the joint model, we have 4 models, right? The target model, non-target model, new lesion, and marginal. So, and we started to have a weight of 1/4 for all of them. However, it gets updated using the Bayes theorem, using the Rafferty the calculation mentioned by Rafferty in 2000, I think it's 2001 statistical science paper. So basically, we saw that the new lesion plays a very important role in the prediction overall, and at least until 200. But after 300, of course, as I said, when we get a long-term survival, actually many patients already crossed over, and they come up with basically they get the other subsequent treatment, which are not the drug or even study drug. On that case, their progression data is not that predictive. However, survival start to play a better role in a long-term case, which is not, I mean, when we talk to clinicians, they were not surprised completely about the outcome. They actually find it's pretty intuitive that having new lesion patients has more risk of death, it seems, in this occasion. However, this is in one scenario, so it's very much scenario specific. So we also, as we say, we also looked into another, and then we looked into the predicted survival. This is based on the average of 1 million predictions. It seems to be on 351 death. We were assuming that we will see a near significant event, and when we did the actual data analysis, we were pretty close to that as well in this. The bound here is not really the confidence bound. It's where the predictions were in overall survival, where you basically see this region. That's not the survival's confidence boundary, rather than where the predictions were lying in. And we seems to be predicting pretty well the path in this case. So we also, as I said, we also looked into the predicted number of death at primary analysis using different model. And the prediction seems to be, once again, we saw a pretty strong performance from all of the three models when we take the prediction into account, progression-free survival information into account compared to ignoring it. Especially, we saw that using overall survival data alone, because there were few early deaths on there. I mean, it really was predicting pretty off overall. And again, the x-axis here is the number of deaths. So we consolidate the data. Basically, we consolidated the data after 50 events. Then after 100 event, we run 1 million simulation of the prediction exercise. And the y-axis here basically is a number of events. We are trying to see when 146. Basically, at the time of the interval, at the final PFS analysis, how many events are being predicted by each model. Just to complete the health economics modeling exercise, we also looked into extrapolation of the curve based on this different models that we proposed. That means when we say extrapolation, we looked into when the last patient died. We kind of look into for treatment arm, control arm, using the model that we proposed. And it seems that using model-based approach with progression-free survival into this increase the precision compared to if one uses only overall survival data, which is not only JM. I would say others as well do the same. But it's kind of if one doesn't use that model, the precision is basically much more worse compared to others. If you look into only marginal, it's pretty much more worsening overall prediction of the difference area. So what we look into there is the area under the curve to see the gain in the expected lifetime, which we find the estimation was much more better when we bring in the prediction information into it's much more realistic, where overall survival alone was much more off in that context. So of course we are statistician. We don't believe, right, one data speaks, or two data speaks. We believe we need to do an extensive simulation in order to understand the model behaviors further. So what we did, we performed a extensive simulation study using different assumptions. So one of the assumption was the risk of death is not dependent on progression component. So we basically generated the data based on the model. So we make assumption how it is related to different component of progression, and we generated the overall survival data. And we consolidated. So we used a very similar setup of the trial. We were trying to predict again the 341 event, but under different assumptions. And we basically cut off the data at 100, 200, because as you understand, the simulations were even more computational intensive. We didn't do 146 anymore. We looked into 100, 200, and 300. And we take an assumption when it is independent of the component, when it is really dependent on the target lesion or the tumor burden at the baseline, as well as we looked into when it is dependent on the risk of having non-target lesion worsening, basically. And under all the situations, so the plot that you see on the right side is basically, we assess the bias, the prediction bias, and the MSE based on 1,000 simulations. So within that, remember, when we say 1,000 simulation, that's 1,000 data constellation. Within each simulation, there are 5,000 predictions, basically. So it's pretty heavy dimensional simulation overall. And when we looked into that, we saw that our model doesn't work too bad in terms of when the joint model works reasonable, when even you have an independent assumption. However, it definitely perform much better in the context of when you have dependency along that. It's really try to capture the prediction much better. So just to conclude the remark, and I just want to keep 15 minutes for questioning. I mean, so basically what we say, the model-based death play an important role in planning for health regulatory processes when we want to do an updated survival analysis, as well as when the HTA application, if you look into how to do a better economic evaluation of the cancer data. Then exploring the association of the disease-free survival and the death improves the overall progression. And the proposed joint model actually provides a much more flexible, because we try to gain information from all the system compared to others. However, though it's kind of what we were hoping that this should be best out of all, but I must say this is kind of if one actually and there are certain benefits. We saw a little bit of accuracy on that. However, the main message is, if you really think about this prediction exercise, think about the other data available rather than only looking into overall survival data, and and that will give actually a much better prediction compared to doing it alone, which is sort of the regular exercise. With that, I would like to just hear the few references I just wanted to mention regarding exploring, which gives us the idea of the model when people looked into the correlation between two endpoints. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Satrajit, for a very nice presentation on this important topic. You know that it is truly closely related to our daily work, like to predict the OS events, like in the process of the trials. So let's move into the Q&A session. If you have any questions from the audience, please unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
This is Peter Thal at MD Anderson. So one of the major issues with cancer treatment is that, for example, in your trial where you randomize them between an experimental agent and standard of care, invariably what's done at disease progression is that they give them some sort of salvage therapy. And depending on the patient and the disease, they may even get 2 or 3 salvage therapies successively. This is especially relevant now that they're using targeted immunotherapies. So that what you're comparing when you look at survival is not only the frontline therapies, but also the effects of salvage.
No, Dr. Thal, I completely agree with you. And that's where I guess in our setting here, it was more targeted therapy setting. I mean, there was no salvage therapy involved in this. But of course, if we have such a therapy, that has to bring up to the model as well, the effect there.
Well, if it's not in the data set, it should be, because they're not going to just let them die when they progress. They are
Right.
going to give them something else unless they're just untreatable.
Exactly. And that's another reason we find once the patient was actually going long term, right, Dr. Thal, that prediction is no more their good predictor because they were given all those salvage therapies. That's why we kind of tried to bring in overall survival alone model, the marginal model, into the prediction, because they may be following a different trend, but having a more information about salvage therapy would definitely improve the model.
I guess my point is not directed at getting better predictions, but at the issue of what is it that you're evaluating.
Right. Mm-hmm. Agree.
Any more questions? So I've one. Oh, so I think we have someone.
So yeah, thank you for the presentation. This is Xing from Gilead and CAT. So I think this presentation is very relative from a clinical perspective. Based on the presentation, from my understanding, is the new lesion and also the survival model seem the key factor when we approaching to the primary analysis. Basically, when we get to the final target, that's even number. So these two model, if we can count the new lesion cell time and also overall cell time, maybe we can simplify the prediction. So that's my immediate impression for this knowledge or for this information. Maybe I got some comments here.
Sure, no, that's a great comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, see, Alicia, you unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry, that was a headset issue. Okay, thank you first of all for the talk, Satrajit. It was very interesting. So my question is on the box plots that you were showing, where you summarize the results across the 4 models, and in particular the multi-state model. You commented on the fact that the multi-state model tends to overshoot compared to the other ones, but that it does also tend to have slightly smaller variability, I think I saw across the various box plots. My curiosity was just if you had any hypothesis or any ideas as to why it was overshooting.
I think it's because so what we did, we still kind of invest, but I had 2-3 perspectives. So what we did, we looked into that further, and we looked into 2 or 3 kind of a model in order to see that if it's a modeling issue. Basically, I think what's happening at the end, that it's kind of a we're seeing that when we try to predict, when we were doing the prediction, and maybe there are more factors in more variability into the data, which the model was not able to, based on the model what it learned, it not able to really kind of capture. And it's sort of, the prediction gets very skewed towards the extreme on that occasion. We actually tried also the exponential model just in order to see if that's an issue, because we are using Webble or Gamma at the beginning. Yeah, that's another area we are exploring a little bit. We are seeing a consistent pattern that it's kind of a, when especially when you have a lot of early death happening, right? It's basically, and then things delay a little bit. The rest of the patient who are on drug is kind of doing well. We see it tend to sort of say that, okay, they're going to have a much more longer time. That's what we saw so far, but that's an area we are still exploring further.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting.
Yeah, we have two questions from Jeffrey Johnson in the chat box. Maybe let's from the first question. Like the first question is how do we interpret time-dependent subject-specific probability distributions in a random effects model? Do such statements represent the emergent pattern if we could go to a specific point in time, many thousands of times each time observing the same subject under slightly different initial conditions? Do they represent a now expired causal propensity? Do such probability statements represent a subject's endpoint having existed in a superposition of states until until the wave function collapse upon observation? There are multiple universes. Such statements unfalsifiable and invalid as evidence.
Thank you. I do not have further comment on that, but definitely interesting perspective to think of.
Okay, yeah, and the second question, can the problem be tackled much more practically by focusing on marginal estimation using a working independence partial likelihood model that avoids specification of a copula with natural frequencies inference utilizing empirical sandwich standard error calculations?
Yes, definitely. But I mean, as I say, I mean, I'm not here really if Bayesian is better than frequentist or other. I mean, that discussion, we find it's computationally more intuitive for us to look into in a Bayesian inference and looking into posterior predictive. But I mean, of course, one can do bootstrap and other ways to do that in the prediction. The prediction part we find very natural in Bayesian setting. That's why we opt for Bayesian setting, but of course, other settings are welcome.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for your response. Any more questions? Yeah, I have a question maybe like similar to Dr. Sal's question, but like, nowadays it's take like much longer time to reach the OS endpoint.
Yes.
Yeah, so like, is there any like approach to handle this kind of like potentially confounding factors as the trial
Yes.
progresses? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we can add time, as you said, the more time-dependent covariates into the model, into the longitudinal model, as well as in the survival model, if you have such information. I mean, the major problem of most of the trial, we do not have, I mean, once the patient progress, right? I mean, the problem is, what happened, most of them, especially in this setting, when we were doing a second line, patients jump into a new trial and they take off the informed consent. And at the end of the day, you end up with mostly survival information. But if you have such information available, that would be definitely very valuable to put in, as Dr. Thal alluded as well.
Yeah, has your team like compared your model like with some like simple just using the PFS as a predictor?
Yeah, PFS is much more stronger. I fully agree. I mean,
Okay.
a prediction of PFS is you have a very solid data. I mean, we worked on the
Yeah.
PFS. I mean, that turned out to be because the problem was OS, and especially when you have a patient who are not longer survival, thankfully, thanks to God. I mean, it's basically, which is a good thing, but when we look into this longer term endpoint based on the shorter term endpoint, that's where the challenge come in. I think if you're modeling the shorter term, we have a much more strong, robust models already exist at this point to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which we often do, right? For a blinded data for PFS number of event estimation, right? We look into different models to do that.
Yeah. Okay, like last call. Any more questions? So if no more questions, let's thank Satrajit again for his very nice presentation, and thank you all for joining our webinar today, and stay tuned for our next month's ISBS webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the
Thank you so
invitation.
much.
Thanks all
Yep. Thank
for
you.
attending.